Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command, and we're here continuing our history of science fiction film. And first, I wanted to just kind of bring you up to speed. As you know, we're raising money to shoot the rest of Forgiveness in January. We started a GoFundMe campaign, which is listed just down here. You can still buy Space Command shares for $7,500 each. About 20 of those would allow us to roll camera. So you can call me at Mark Zicree. You can call me at 323-363-1259 or email me at markzicree@gmail.com. Also, as you recall, a couple months ago, we shot the scene with Nichelle Nichols, which we're about to release very shortly. And we want to shoot a new scene with Mira Furlan, one of our stars in the pilot. And this is for her sequence in Forgiveness, our second 2-hour story. And just as with Nichelle, it took about 15 grand to get everything up and running so we could roll camera on that. If you buy 2 shares in Space Command, 15 grand, that'll allow us to roll camera on this wonderful sequence with Mira Furlan, whom I worked with on Babylon 5, who you may know from Lost, who's just a spectacular actress. And if you've been watching Space Command, the first hour that we've put out, you know she's just doing a great job. So if anyone wants to buy 2 shares and make that happen, we'll dedicate that shooting day to you, and we'll do it in the next few weeks. And we're building costumes now for that sequence. We're building, I have the furniture, and we've got the actors ready and waiting. So just feel free to contact me, and we can make that happen. So that's it for now about Space Command. But right now, we go into our history of science fiction film. Now, we started with the beginning of cinema, and we've gotten up to the 50s. We've gone all through the 50s, which was a really amazing era for science fiction film, because prior to that, science fiction films were very sporadic, very few and far between. So you might get, a Metropolis in the 20s and Things to Come in the 30s, but you were waiting a long time between science fiction movies. Then in the 50s, because of fear of nuclear annihilation, fear of the atom bomb, fear of radiation, fear of invasion. You had tons and tons of science fiction movies, and some of them were great, like Day the Earth Stood Still and When Worlds Collide and Forbidden Planet and so forth. But now we move into the 60s. Now, previously, the preoccupations of film in the 50s had primarily been related to invasion, nuclear Armageddon, radiation, making gigantic insects and things, and space exploration, the possibility of space exploration, because the space program was just starting with Sputnik and then NASA being formed and so forth. But it really ramped up in the 60s. You got a wider variety of kinds of stories, and you started to get an interesting phenomenon, because prior to this, particularly in the 50s, science fiction movies, with the exception of a Day the Earth Stood Still or a Forbidden Planet, were basically B movies, meaning that they were lower budget, the cast were lesser known actors, they'd have a little bit of fame, but they wouldn't be the big A-list movie stars. Now, as you move through the 60s, that starts to change. And with this video, we're just going to be talking about the first half of the 60s, because there's so many films, and we can really cover a lot of ground. Additionally, in the 50s, a lot of the science fiction movies were written by non-science fiction writers. In the 60s, you'd start to get more films that were either scripted by science fiction writers or based on their books. And so we'll get into that as well. So though of course H.G. Wells has been served pretty well by Things to Come and War of the Worlds and so forth, and Jules Verne too, with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a journey to the center of the earth. But now we get into the 60s. 1960, we're going to go year by year. Now, I mentioned that in the 1950s, starting with Destination Moon and Rocket Ship XM, you had these rocket to the moon stories, and there were a lot of them. And by the time you got to the 1960s, you had far fewer man landing on the moon films, because we were actually going to the moon. We had a moon program, and so reality was eclipsing the imagination, the fantastic. But the beginning of 1960, you saw a moon film, a moon exploration film called 12 to the Moon, and it was this multiracial, multi ethnic cast going to the moon. And interestingly enough, it was directed by David Bradley, who was one of my teachers at UCLA when I was an art major. I took a lot of film classes there, and David Bradley actually showed the beginning of 12 to the Moon, a 35 millimeter print when we were students in his class. He was a terrific guy, and it was a fun film to look at, but really not covering any new ground per se. But then you start getting noir directors like Edgar G. Ulmer directing The Amazing Transparent Man. You still have, Atomic War Bride and, Cape Canaveral monsters and dinosaurs. So you've still got monster movies. You've still got, Fear of Atomic Radiation movies. But that stuff's starting to fade off, and you start to get more interesting films. Now in 1912, Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote this wonderful book. This is one of my favorite books. That's a first edition there. That's the first edition, 1912, of The Lost World with dust jacket, very rare. And but Arthur Conan Doyle did that book, and it was made into a very good silent film called The Lost World in the 1920s, starring Wallace Beery. And then in 1960, it was remade by Irwin Allen, who would become a very big producer in television with Lost in Space and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Land of the Giants. And then he would go on to be a disaster movie guy, so with things like The Towering Inferno and so forth. But here he was still in movies, and The Lost World was kind of a low-rent version, because the great way to do dinosaurs through the 50s and 60s and 70s was stop motion animation. And of course, Jim Danforth was doing a great job with that in movies like 1 Million BC, which we'll talk about later. And of course, Ray Harryhausen was the disciple of the great Willis O'Brien, who had done King Kong in 1933 and The Lost World in 1920, I think it was 25. And but the cheap way to do it, the bad way to do it, was you just get real lizards like iguanas, and you put little things on them, and you just make them look like dinosaurs, and it's pathetic and sad and not fun. So this version of Lost World is not a good one. It stars Michael Rennie from Dave the Earth Stood Still, and Claude Rains from The Invisible Man and many other great films, and Jill St. John, who's very pretty and was in a lot of stuff in TV and film, and David Hedison, who later would star in Irwin Allen's TV series Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, but he'd also been previously, under his previous actor name of Al Hedison, he had been one of the stars of The Fly. So, but this is a film. It's okay, but not great. But also during the '60s, we also tended to get a lot more foreign films. We had started to do that with films like Godzilla, which was in Japan called Gojira. You'd basically get these movies dubbed into English because people didn't have patience for subtitles unless they were art films like Ingmar Bergman. But so these were dubbed, and so you got. Now, in 1960, there was a very, very interesting film called The Silent Star, which was a East German Polish co-production, and it ultimately was released in America as The First Spaceship on Venus. And it's based on a work by Stanislaw Lem, who of course was the great writer of Solaris, which is, we have the first edition of that here. Solaris is a movie we'll talk about when we get to Tarkovsky in the 70s. But Stanislaw Lem was a very popular novelist in the Eastern Bloc. He wasn't really well known yet in America, but First Spaceship on Venus is a really good science fiction film. But if you're going to watch it, watch the original version. Thankfully now the original versions of these films are coming out, and you can actually watch them in their original language and their original cut, because this film was actually very critical of nuclear war, and that really doesn't come across in this version, but it does come across in the original version. It's a multinational cast. It's in color. The visual effects are very, very impressive. It's a fun film. I really like the film a lot. And then of course, also in 1960, we get one of the great science fiction films, and I will show you. It's again based on H.G. Wells. This is the first edition of that book, Time Machine. Again, one of my absolute favorite books. And this is a lobby card, a Spanish lobby card of that movie, The Time Machine. And if you can see this with all the glare, it starred Rod Taylor, Yvette Mimieux, Alan Young, and it was written by David Duncan and directed by George Pal, who also produced it. Now, George Pal had done Destination Moon. He'd done When Worlds Collide. He was with Harryhausen. He was sort of the one one of the two guys who were doing regularly doing interesting quality science fiction films and fantasy films where you knew that if their name was on it, it was going to be interesting and entertaining. So The Time Machine is a wonderful film. There have been later versions of it, not nearly as good. William Tuttle did wonderful makeup for the Morlocks in it, and Rod Taylor was an ideal hero who could both seem intelligent and also kind of two-fisted, very masculine. Yvette Mimieux is charming as Weena. Alan Young is very touching as the time traveler's friend. And if you get the DVD, maybe it's also on the Blu-ray. They actually shot, when they released the DVD, a little featurette that was a sequel with Alan Young and Rod Taylor maybe 30 years later, and it's really charming and sweet. And so I definitely would urge you to look at that. And my friend Bob Burns owns the time machine prop that was used in that film. It's one of the great props ever built for any movie, and Bob Burns restored it. He got it at the MGM auction, and just a phenomenal piece of design, beautifully designed. And again, this was before the steampunk movement, but definitely a steampunk kind of story, where you see the Victorian era with all sorts of futuristic inventions in that period. So if you haven't seen The Time Machine, I highly recommend it. Then also that same year, now also science fiction was being used in drama, but also every now and then it would be in comedy. So you have a movie called Visit to a Small Planet, in which Jerry Lewis plays an alien from space. Jerry Lewis, of course, was making very broad slapstick comedies. By this time, he'd left his partnership with Dean Martin. And this is based on a play by Gore Vidal, who was a well-known writer of the era, he was sort of in the same rank as guys like Truman Capote, but not as well known now. But it's okay, not great, but that's the way it goes. So now 1961, we also saw another George Pell film, directed by George Pell, Atlantis: The Lost Continent, which is a film I really like. It's a little rough around the edges, but it has people being turned into beasts, sort of a reverse Dr. Moreau kind of thing, and it's just entertaining. It's set in the ancient world. Again, kind of a quasi Ray Harryhausen kind of film, or at least the territory that Harryhausen would be going into more and more often. But again, a fun film, well worth watching. So now, but again, we talked about major studios making some kind of quasi science fiction films, and The Absent-Minded Professor is one of those. It starred Fred MacMurray, who had been in Double Indemnity, a great actor in that film. Now he's playing. He was starring in a TV show called My Three Sons in the '60s, and so he became sort of. Whereas in the '40s he played kind of hard-boiled kind of characters. By the '60s he was playing kind of affable father kind of type. So he plays sort of the absent-minded professor. He creates a sort of this silly putty kind of stuff called Flubber. It was a film made by Disney. Again, not great. It was directed by Robert Stevenson, who would also do The Twilight Zone. But again, kind of fun and goofy in its strange way. But again, they kept making science fiction films. Now, science fiction films, as I say, were still more or less relegated to B movies. And if you don't know what a B movie it is, back then movies used to be on a double bill. So you'd go see an A-list film, like Spartacus was an A-list film with big movie stars, and then there'd be a second film, a lesser film usually, to round out the bill. And that would be those were called B movies, like the B side of a record. And so a lot of these science fiction films were sort of that, or they would be films showing at drive-in movies. So there's a film, again, in 1961 called The Day the Earth Caught Fire. It's a fun film. It's about Earth kind of heating up and everything falling apart and humanity coming to an end. And it's a good film. It's directed by Val Guest, who did some really good science fiction films in the '50s. But, in fact, I think I was on a panel with him. He was a very nice guy, a very smart guy. And this is a British film. But Rod Serling did it better in Twilight Zone with The Midnight Sun, and he did it in a half hour. So they're very interesting to compare, though. And of course, during the '60s, you tend to have, like, if something's going to go wrong or go awry, it's crazy beatniks. It's beatniks having parties and running riot and, beatniks. And then it'd be hippies and so forth. So in the '60s, late '60s into the early '70s. But it's a fun film, a British film. And then also from England that same year was Gorgo, which is kind of like Godzilla, big monster, reptilian monster guy in a suit. Not a bad film, kind of fun, if you're not doing anything else, it's not bad to watch. And but then we get a movie like Master of the World. Now, Master of the World is a really fun film. It's got a great cast. It's basically a I was going to say a ripoff. It's not exactly a ripoff, but it's certainly a trope on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which had been successful as an A-list picture several years earlier for Disney with James Mason as Captain Nemo. This took two Jules Verne novels, Master of the World and Robur the Conqueror. They hired Richard Matheson, who was a writer for Twilight Zone and a novelist who'd done The Shrinking Man, which had been made into a successful movie, and they hired him to write it. And it's about a flying ship, an airship, but it's still about someone, a Nemo-like character who's anti-war but using weapons of war against the armaments manufacturers and the armies and so forth. So Vincent Price is very good in this film. Charles Bronson plays a pacifist, as he would also do in the Twilight Zone episode 2, which is an After the Bomb story with Elizabeth Montgomery. And it also has Henry Hull, who had played the Werewolf of London in the 30s very effectively, and now he's older, and so he's kind of a guest star, a supporting role in this film. But it's a fun film. It's a good film. I like it very much. Charles Bronson's very good in it. And later he would, of course, be known for Death Wish and kind of action films where he'd play sort of a vigilante kind of character. But he plays very well against type in this, and I recommend it. Now, you also start getting, after Gojira / Godzilla, you started getting Japanese imports that were other monsters, and sometimes they would fight Godzilla. And so you get movies like Mothra, and Mothra was a big moth, of course, and it was dubbed into English and released in America. And George Takei did, I think, some of the voices, a number of voices in that. And this is before Star Trek, so you can, if you listen, you'll hear his voice. And it came out and it was successful. And so you had a lot of Japanese monster movies coming to America. At the same time, in 1961, you got Mysterious Island. Now, I mentioned earlier when we were talking about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that here we go. This is the first American edition of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and it's a great book, beautifully illustrated. And Jules Verne really liked the character of Nemo, wanted to do a sequel, so he wrote Mysterious Island, where Nemo appears again. So in 1961, they made the movie of Mysterious Island, and it was a Ray Harryhausen film. Now, the fascinating thing about Harryhausen is that in any movie where Harryhausen is doing the stop motion animation, he's basically the star of the film. His creatures are the stars of the film, and the director and the writer, actors are secondary to that. And he also had the say over everyone. So if it was a contest between him and the director would be fired, and Harryhausen would be kept by Charles Schneer, his producing partner. So Mysterious Island is a very good movie. So this year had two Jules Verne adaptations, and Mysterious Island has Michael Callan in it. It's got a very solid cast. It starts during the American Civil War, and it's about an island with gigantic creatures that are stop motion animation, gigantic bees and a gigantic chicken and so forth, and Captain Nemo shows up. But in this movie, he's played by Herbert Lom, who would be a sort of Inspector Clouseau's nemesis in the Pink Panther movies, but here he's very good as Nemo, not as good as the wonderful James Mason, but certainly credible. And then we get The Phantom Planet, which is, here it is, Phantom Planet, which is a movie I really loved when I was a kid. It's got this strange, weird monster, and it's about an American astronaut who goes to an asteroid, I think, and he shrinks down and meets these little teeny tiny people. And it's a fun film. I really enjoyed it, and it's available where you can watch it. And of course, many of these films are also available on Amazon or Netflix or even YouTube. With any of these 1950s, 1960s science fiction movies, first go on YouTube and see if they're there, because then you don't have to spend money to see them. But they're well worth seeing. So then, rounding out 1961, we get Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and that's, let's see, where is it? It's right around here somewhere. Let me find it. It is, here it is. Yay! This is the special global warming edition that came out recently, And Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea has the Sea View, which is a great futuristic submarine with windows in the front, a wonderful design. And this is the feature film that came first, and it stars Robert Sterling and Walter Pidgeon, who had been in Forbidden Planet a few years earlier, and Barbara Eden, who later would star in I Dream of Jeannie, and she was terrific, of course. And this movie was so successful that it spawned a TV series, which would have David Hedison, whom Irwin Allen had just worked with the year before, and it would have Richard Basehart playing Admiral Nelson, replacing Walter Pidgeon in that role. So when we talk about science fiction on television, we'll talk about that. But this is a very fun film. The Van Allen belt catches fire, and this film's in color, in glorious color, and well worth your time, and very, very fun. And Michael Ansara is in it, and he would then marry Barbara Eden for a time, and he's also terrific in the Outer Limits episode Soldier, which Harlan Ellison wrote, and we'll get into that in the near future as well. So now we move on to 1962, and previously I've talked about films where you saw them as a kid and you remember them as wonderful, then you see them as an adult and you realize they're really crap, or at least low budget and threadbare, but you hold both versions of that movie in your head, so you have two versions: the wonderful version you saw as a kid, which you can watch in your mind, and the less wonderful version you saw as an adult. And for me, Creation of the Humanoids is one of those, and here it is. And those are the humanoids. They've got blue-gray skin and silver eyes and bald heads, and it's a parable on racism, just like I, Robot would later be with Will Smith, and it has these humanoids, basically androids, who are called clickers by the anti-humanoid league, and it's a very fun, very talky film, rather static, but I really, really like this film. And it was the last makeup design by the great Jack Pierce, who did Frankenstein, and he did Bride of Frankenstein, he did The Wolfman and The Mummy, one of the great, great, great all-time makeup geniuses. And I remember when I was a kid seeing him on the Ben Hunter show, a TV talk show here in LA, make the host up into a humanoid. And they wore silver contact lenses, which they were hard contact lenses. I understand they were pretty painful to wear at the time. They'd later be used in, these silver kind of contact lenses would later be used in the second Star Trek pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, to great effect. But I find this a very fun and very sweet film. It's just, it has a special place in my heart. I think it was based on a stage play, oddly enough, and it's, just check it out, and maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't, but I love this film for no good reason. So, but it's really, 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 really fun. So then we get a major film, Day of the Triffids. Now, Day of the Triffids, I will show you several examples. It was written by the wonderful John Wyndham. Technology. It was written by John Wyndham. Now, John Wyndham had been writing under various pseudonyms through the 30s and 40s, and things like Stowaway to the Moon and so forth, not really making much of a dent, selling mainly to American magazines, the pulps. And then in the 50s, he decided to reinvent himself. He was a pal of Arthur C. Clarke and a lot of the British writers. He lived in Britain, although he was writing for the American market. And he came up with an idea. He wanted to start writing novels rather than just imitate what other people were doing. He wanted to do something that was set in as real an environment as possible, and set it in England, which he knew very, very, very well. And so he came up with this idea of a man who wakes up in a hospital, and it's the night after a shower of meteorites, very brightly colored, and his eyes have been bandaged because he was stung by these creatures called triffids that are plants, but they can actually walk, and they sting people, and they go for the eyes. And he was stung, and his eyes are wrapped in bandages while he convalesces in the hospital. And when he wakes up, he finds that everyone who watched the meteor shower the previous night around the world has gone blind, and he's one of the few people left with sight. And it's a great, great, great story and a wonderful novel. This is the British first edition, which you can see here. Really cool cover. That's John Wyndham there. If you can, let me see if you can make that out. It's a little hard to see, but very British. And this is the American first edition. And then in 1962, they made the movie. And this is the movie, Day of the Triffids. It's quite a fun film. Very, very fun. And this is the movie edition that came out It stars Howard Keel. Again, as we were talking about in the 1950s, often British science fiction movies would get an American movie star, maybe slightly on the fade. Now, Howard Keel had been in many, many musicals. And for instance, Kiss Me Kate, he's the lead in that film in the 50s. Wonderful singing voice, but he's quite credible in this movie. It's a strange film in its way, but it works. It really works, and it's been made again and again. There've been TV versions, there've been radio versions, often very, very good. And the plot basically is basically taken for the movie 28 Days Later, and they kind of substitute zombies for walking plants, but it's basically the same plot, which is more or less a guy wakes up in a hospital that doesn't know the world's come to an end, runs into other people, so forth, gets endangered by humans and the monsters. And so basically, you'll see, if you watch both films, you'll see a lot of similarities. But Day of the Triffids is a really fun film, a wonderful novel, and I recommend both. So again, that and but it's worth watching. But then we start getting science fiction art films as well. And so there's a film called La Jetée, which was a French film. It's about time travel. It's told with still black and white photos. It's worth checking out. It's interesting and strange and melancholy. An interesting film. And but then we get Journey to the Seventh Planet, which is from Denmark, but still has John Agar in it, who had been in a lot of science fiction movies in the 50s. You also get Panic in the Year Zero, which is another after the bomb story, as those are kind of fading out. And it stars Ray Milland, who again was a big movie star in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s. He won an Oscar for The Lost Weekend, where he played an alcoholic. But by the 60s, he's on the fade, and but taking the roles he can take. Not a bad film, kind of fun. But then we get a really, really interesting film called Planeta Burr, and it's a Russian film. And here it is. It's Planet of Storms, and this is another science fiction film inspired by Stanislaw Lem's work. And it's a really fun science fiction film, really cool spacesuits, a cool little space car. In fact, here on the back you can see a little bit of what that space car looks like, and there's all sorts of cool stuff in it. And again, this was taken, Roger Corman bought the rights to this, and there were 3 movies made from the footage of this film. We'll get them in a moment. But if you can see the original Russian version, it's well worth seeing, and again, very, very fun. I like a number of these Eastern Bloc films that finally made their way in their original versions to America decades later. But then in the 60s, in 1963, we start to get some really strange, interesting films. The Crawling Hand, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an astronaut has a hand cut off, and it walks and it lives on its own, and it's scary and dangerous, and it scared the hell out of me when I was a kid. It has Kent Taylor in it, another stalwart of these kind of films. But then we also get a film, The Damned, which is a British film. Joseph Losey was a director who had been blacklisted in the 50s in America, so he went to England to continue directing films where being a communist wasn't, or being accused of being a communist wasn't a big deal. And so he made this film about radiation, and has MacDonald Carey in it, and Vivica Lindford, who was a popular British bombshell. And it's a totally credible film. It's frequently confused with Children of the Damned, which was made around that time, and that was based on John Williams' Midwich Cuckoos. Here's a first edition of that, and but it's not the same film at all. But it's worth seeing. It's a good film. It's a sad film, a very sad film. And then also in '63, we now also in America we had Kennedy. And as the president at this point, he was there was a youthful, positive vibe in the air. There were people, a lot of young people were signing up for the Peace Corps. The space race had gotten started because Kennedy said, by the end of the decade we'll put a man on the moon, which we did. And but sadly Kennedy wasn't here to see it. But that's what happened. So the movie started to be in certain ways more positive. There's a different feeling in the wind, and also the space going films kind of start to get better incrementally. And one that's really good is this one. It's from Czechoslovakia, again Eastern Bloc. It's Ikari XB1, which is Icarus XB1, and it was released in America as Voyage to the End of the Universe. But this is the original Czech version. with subtitles. And this is a film that, if you watch it, you'll see certain shots that look vaguely familiar. And the reason is because Stanley Kubrick saw this film and it inspired the set design for 2001. And if you watch this, it'll immediately become clear how this visually inspired Kubrick. So you might really want to check it out. I really like the film. Again, it's dealing with nuclear war and radiation and all these things, and it's a very, very good film, very memorable, and it's got a really great look to it. At the same time, same year, you get The Nutty Professor, which is the sequel to The Absent-Minded Professor. Still has, no, I'm sorry, I misspeak myself. The Nutty Professor is another Jerry Lewis science fiction film. It was made into an Eddie Murphy vehicle. It's a sort of a Jekyll and Hyde thing, except that in this, Jerry Lewis is kind of a homely, goofy scientist, and then when he drinks the potion he comes up with, he turns into kind of this lounge lizard kind of guy who's supposed to be cool and attractive, but Jesus. And again, your ability to stand this film depends on your ability to stand Jerry Lewis. It's not something I would spend time doing. I saw it as a kid. That's plenty for me. But there you go. But Son of Flubber was the film that was the sequel in 1963 to The Absent-Minded Professor. Still stars Fred MacMurray, and it's okay. And then Ray Milland, who previously had done Panic in the Year Zero, this year did X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, which, interestingly enough, also has a varied cast in it, including Don Rickles, who was an insult comic of the era, who had some very interesting serious roles in movies, and this is one of them. And it's a dark film, but it's about a guy who gets X-ray vision, and it becomes a curse. And there was a really good comic book adaptation of it that I had when I was a kid, and it scared the hell out of me. And this film is scared the hell out of me too. But it was done by Roger Corman, one of Corman's better films. A lot of his films are very forgettable, but this one was. I liked it. And so now we move into 1964, and we get another great H.G. Wells adaptation. Now H.G. Wells wrote, there was a period from about 1895 to around 1901 where Wells wrote year after year after year great science fiction novels, just one after the other. The Time Machine, The First Man on the Moon, The War of the Worlds, Island of Dr. Moreau. And this is a first edition of The First Man in the Moon, and it actually has a book plate by the guy who owned it around 1901. And this is Elmer Cook, and you can see it says Elmer Cook, London. I love books that have signatures or inscriptions or book plates. And this is the title page with an illustration of the two moon travelers. It seems to be deserted, said Cavour. Absolutely desolate. There they are on the moon. Turns out it's not absolutely desolate. There are moon men who are called Selenites. And there had been an earlier sort of ripoff of this book in the early part of the 20th century, and that was a great film, Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon. And this is a French film, but it rips off both Jules Verne's Trip to the Moon and The First Man in the Moon by Wells, and it has Selenites in it. And this DVD release includes a restored, hand-colored version of the film with both subtitles, and they also would have actors in the theaters reading scripts to match the mouths of the actors on screen. And they actually do that in one of the versions of this, and it's, again, well worth watching. But by the time we get to 1964, we get Ray Harryhausen's First Man on the Moon. And it's a wonderful film, and it has Cavour, and it has the Selenites, and the Selenites are, of course, animated by Ray Harryhausen, so they're wonderful. And it's a strange, sad film, and they updated it in a very interesting way, which is they have the British in the 1960s as the first men landing on the moon, and they find a British flag and from the 1890s or 1900, and they find the elderly man who was the young man who went with Cavour to the moon at the turn of the century, and he tells the story of what happened. And it's very faithful to the book. It's sad, and it's a really good film. And again, First Man on the Moon has been done many times in many different ways. There's some very good BBC radio adaptations of it, but I highly recommend the Harryhausen version. And again, when you look at Harryhausen from the 50s through the 60s into the 70s, which is basically the 30 years of his great output of work, he's doing film after film after film where they're all masterful. They're all entertaining. And again, with stop motion animation, first of all, his design skills were terrific. He was a wonderful artist, a wonderful sculptor, because he made all of the maquettes himself, designed them and made them, and they would basically have a metal armature inside, and then they'd be covered with foam rubber, and he would move them frame by frame by frame. And if he screwed it up, he had to keep it all in his head. And if he screwed it up, because there were 24 frames to a second, and so 24 frames to a second, 60 seconds to a minute. So that gives you an idea of how many times he would have to move incrementally to get natural looking motion. And it was astonishing that he would do this. One man working on a tabletop, and he would plan the set pieces before the movie was made. And it was just a spectacular feat of genius. And I got to know Harryhausen because I was teamed with him to make some of his unmade projects about 10 years ago, a little more, around 2005. And so I got to get to know him and see the armatures, his creatures in his house, in his trophy room. It was an amazing experience. And but now he was going basically between science fiction films such as The First Man on the Moon and dinosaur films, and then also he was doing Sinbad movies. So he started out with Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and I remember as a kid going to these films, and they were just magic. And everyone who grew up in that era, whether it's Guillermo del Toro or George Lucas, any of us, Steven Spielberg, we all fell in love with Harryhausen's work and with Harryhausen himself. And the fact that he and Ray Bradbury were pals from age 16 on is just a wonderful thing. So First Man on the Moon, great film, really worth seeing. And Lionel Jeffries plays Cavor, and it's really terrific, and it's in color, really a great film. Now then, we also have another film from Japan, Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, and again, these are all creatures that are in the Godzilla world, and they would basically make little teeny tiny cities and then have guys in monster suits, big rubber monster suits, stomping things flat and knocking over buildings. And it has its charm. It's a different style, but really, a lot of people love those films, and I saw that stuff when I was a kid, and but I don't watch them now that I'm an adult, except Godzilla. The first one, Godzilla, was actually very, very good. Then we get an Italian film. Again, it stars Vincent Price, who starred in Master of the World. Vincent Price, again, was a well-known actor going back to the 30s into the 40s, and now he's doing, science fiction films and horror films. And The Last Man on Earth was based on this book, I Am Legend, by Richard Matheson. This is a signed copy. To me, this is the first edition. It was a paperback first edition, and that's what Matheson looked like then. That's before he had a beard. People used to say at that period in his life that he looked like Paul Newman because he had bright, bright, bright blue eyes and blonde hair, and a very good-looking man. And this is also the period when he was writing for Twilight Zone, writing just astonishing work. And The Last Man on Earth is a Italian film. In fact, this is an example of it. This is a Vincent Price double feature, House on Haunted Hill from 1958, and The Last Man on Earth. Now, this film has been made 3 times. It's been made as Last Man on Earth, and then a little later in the 60s, The Omega Man, which we'll talk about when we get there, with Charlton Heston, a better film than this one. And then finally, as I Am Legend, starring Will Smith, not a bad film. We'll talk about that when we get there. But this is an interesting film and a good film. The weird thing about Italian films where they were post-dubbed, which meant they recorded the movies, they shot the movies silent, and then in post, they would have the actors dub in the words. So frequently in Italian films, they might have an American movie star or a TV star, like Clint Eastwood in spaghetti westerns, and the other actors would be speaking Italian. So it was very difficult to work in these films. And but Last Man on Earth, not a bad movie, interesting film, and worth checking out. Now then we get to one of my favorite films, and this is a film that stands up. This is Robinson Crusoe on Mars, and I love this film, and so does Criterion. This is the deluxe Criterion edition, and it stars, it's wonderful. If you've seen The Martian, you should absolutely see this film. Robinson Crusoe on Mars it was directed by Byron Haskin, who also directed War of the Worlds, in the 50s, and it is based on a script by Ib Melchior. Ib Melchior did a lot of science fiction films. He was Scandinavian, and I was actually on a panel with him as well. Very charming man, and came up with a lot of great ideas. And Byron Haskin hated his script, and it was reworked. But even so, it's a wonderful, imaginative film. It has props by Hua Cheng, who would go on to do the tricorder and the phaser for Star Trek. And you can see a very similar design aesthetic in this film. And it stars Paul Mantee and Victor London, and they're both wonderful. I got to know both of them. And it's very funny because years later, when I was writing for Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, I was friends with a group of Star Trek novelists, Garfield and Judith Reeves Stevens, who would later write for Enterprise, and Barbara Hambly, and Mel Gilden, and Michael Reeves, who would also write for Star Trek The Next Generation, and Vonda McIntyre. And we formed a club called the Rubber Ears Club. And we would meet. We would have dinner once a month and just talk. And we were friends, and we're still friends. And I actually would later write the first Magic Time novel with Barbara Hambly. We were pals, and she taught me how to write novels essentially. And but one of the surprises I pulled on her was she mentioned she had never seen Robinson Crusoe on Mars, and the others hadn't either. And I said, you must see this. It's a wonderful film, and it also has Adam. Um, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he played Batman, and it'll come back to me. Of course, I'm going Adam Wayne, but no, of course not. But it was well, actually, it probably says here on the credits. Let's see if it does. No, it doesn't. Interestingly enough, that's very interesting. But but he's also in this, and so they'd never seen it. So I screened it at Barbara Hambly's house, with the rest of the Rubber Ears Club, and as a surprise, I'd met the two stars of the movie, Paul Mantee and Victor London. Now, in this film, they're in great physical shape. Paul Mantee is a wonderful actor. He puts his heart and soul into this film, and it's just fanciful and wonderful, and it has spaceships that are reworked from the ships in War of the Worlds, because again, Byron Haskin directed that film, so they just kind of reworked them for the Martian ships here, and I think they may have even used Destination Moon spacesuits in this, but it's a great film. They shot in Death Valley and also on a soundstage, and if you haven't seen it, it's one of the real gems of the 1960s, and of course the same theme was revisited in The Martian later on, and The Martian's probably the better film of the two, but this really has a very special place in my heart, so I recommend it. So so then we get to the next film, from another film about Mars, but we go from the sublime to the ridiculous, because it's Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. Really a terrible film. The ray guns are whammo air blasters, which was a toy of the era. It's just awful. Just an awful film. They used to show it every year. And it stars one of the child actors is Pia Zadora, who grew up to be sort of a singer and a sex pot, and win the Golden Globe and all sorts of stuff. But this is just a dreadful movie, and not really worth your time unless you really like bad films. But then we get to another cool film, which is The 10th Victim. Now I said earlier that they'd start using science fiction writers for their source material, as they were using H.G. Wells and Richard Matheson. There was a science fiction writer whom I love named Robert Sheckley, and Robert Sheckley wrote these great science fiction short stories in the 50s that were about people running afoul of technology. It dealt with people's neuroses and psychoses, and he was a wonderful writer. And so he wrote a short story called The 10th Victim, which he then expanded to a novel. It was actually called The 7th Victim. It took place in a future where you could hunt other human beings, and it was assassins preying on each other as a sport, basically, as a contest. And Sheckley expanded it to a novel as a tie-in for the movie. It was an Italian film starring Marcello Mastroianni and Ursula Andress, and produced by Carlo Ponti, who was Sophia Loren's husband, and produced by Joseph Levine, who produced the Hercules movie starring Steve Reeves. And this is a fun film, kind of pop art in its sensibility. But Marcello Mastroianni, of course, was the great Italian movie star. He stars in Eight and a Half. He's in many films of Fellini and the other great directors. And if you haven't ever checked him out, definitely watch Eight and a Half. It's a brilliant, brilliant film. And this is a fun film also from around the same time. And Sheckley was a terrific writer. And if you haven't ever read his work, you know, check it out because this is really, really worth it. So good book. Oops, this keeps falling off. Sorry, guys. Low tech. It's low tech. Yikes. But there we go. But yes, so watch The Tenth Victim, and you can find it pretty easily. Another foreign film that came out at this time, and I've got it back there somewhere, but is Alphaville. And Alphaville, we started to have the New Wave, the French New Wave, and there were directors like Jean-Luc Godard and Alain Resnais and so forth. Alain Resnais, of course, directed last year at Marienbad. They were starting to make a name for themselves, and Jean-Luc Godard, there was a series of okay. I mentioned that a lot of actors who weren't basically making it or their careers were on the wane here in America would go to Europe and become movie stars, and so one of these was an actor named Eddie Constantine, and he really didn't make much of a name in America at all. But he went to France and became a big movie star, and he would make a series of films playing sort of a private eye, and they were called, and the character's name was Lemmy Caution, and they were kind of like spy noir detective kind of movies, kind of fun but not very serious. But Jean-Luc Godard had a great idea of making another Lemmy Caution film that would be a science fiction movie, and he made Alphaville, and it's about a computer that is ruling things, and Lemmy Caution is a private eye who goes up against this computer, and it uses cars to talk about space travel. It's set in visually in the modern day, but it uses the tropes of science fiction, and it's a fun film and an interesting film. And again, I saw it in film school at UCLA, and I really liked it. I think maybe David Bradley, who directed 12 to the Moon, screened that film in its entirety. But it's a very, very interesting and strange. It's a co-production between France and Italy. Also has Anna Karina and Akim Tamarov, who would be in some American films as well. I think he's in Touch of Evil, if memory serves, but another great character actor. And a film really worth checking out. Eddie Constantine's a very good, very solid actor, and he's got kind of this Philip Marlowe, Sam Spade kind of look, kind of a weathered look, and really, really a cool film. Also, that same year, 1964, we've got Crack in the World, which is a British science fiction movie with Dana Andrews in it, and again another end of the world. Thank God it's only a motion picture. Picture says the ad copy, but it's fun. And Dana Andrews, of course, was in Curse of the Demon, which is also known as Night of the Demon, the great Jacques Tourneur film. And he's also in movies like Laura in the 50s, in the 40s, and Best Years of Our Lives. He's older here, but still very solid as an actor, very, very solid. And then at the same time in England, you had a hit TV show that debuted in 1963 and called Doctor Who. And this is one of the Doctor Who novels based on one of the early episodes, The Highlanders. But they decided to make some movies featuring these creatures that looked like robots but weren't. They actually had aliens inside of them, and they were called Daleks. And they would say, exterminate, exterminate. So they made a couple of movies starring Peter Cushing as Doctor Who. And they're not great, and they don't have a lot to do with the TV show. But again, they're curiosities, and if you're a Doctor Who fan, you might want to check them out. Peter Cushing, of course, would later become renowned in Star Wars as the guy commanding the Death Star, and then they would generate a CG version of him in one of the recent Star Wars films to a varying degree of success. But Peter Cushing was one of the great British actors. He was in a TV version of 1984 in the 50s. He'd been in a lot of vampire movies, and he was in Sherlock Holmes films and all sorts of stuff. Just a very versatile British actor, always very solid. And so you can check out Doctor Who and the Daleks, 1964. Now, another film that's one of my favorites, and I meant to get the DVD box, but it's called It Happened Here. And I love the film. There's a great making of book. Kevin Brownlow, with his pal Victor Marlowe, he was a documentary filmmaker. He was actually, I think he started working on this film when he was a teenager, and it took 8 years to complete. And different shots are at different points along those 8 years, and so the actors change ages from shot to shot. But the premise of the film is if the Nazis had conquered England, and and uh, and Kevin Brownlow, whom I met, and he actually signed. I met him at Ray Bradbury's house, and he signed. I had a copy of the making of book, which again is very hard to find, but very interesting. And the film is great because Kevin Brownlow was a documentary filmmaker, and he made something that looks absolutely realistic. It's a documentary, a pseudo documentary, and Victor Marlowe was a huge nut on World War II in terms of a devotee, and he had all the costumes and all these. He knew every intimate detail of the uniforms, and he had a ton of the equipment, and they actually got guys who had been Nazis in World War II to play Nazis in this documentary, and they actually even had the head of the I think English Nazi Party talk about his philosophy, and that then those scenes got banned. But in the DVD, again, wonderful DVDs, you can watch the restored version. And there's problems with some of the sound and some of the ADR, but I still highly recommend this film if you're a fan of The Man in the High Castle, which is a great TV show, or SSGB, which is also another really good TV show about if the Nazis had won the war. It's a subgenre of science fiction, alternate history, but it's fascinating, and this is a wonderful film, and I highly recommend it. And Kevin Brownlow went on to become one of the great experts on the silent movies. He wrote a great book called The Parade's Gone By. He did a series of documentaries on Hollywood, the silent era, the James Mason narrated. Because it's another little piece of film minutia was silent films were shot around 16 frames a second or so. But of course, when talkies came in, it was 24 frames a second, whereas silent films were hand cranked, so it was variable. But as a result, whenever they would show silent films on TV or in the movies, they would be too fast. They would be herky jerky and absurdly fast, and so they were basically viewed as funny and peculiar. But then when videotape came in, you could restore them to the proper projection speed. And so the documentary on Hollywood that's narrated by James Mason, you can find episodes of it on YouTube. You got to see the films in their original glory. You got to see clips from the original films, and then you started to get DVDs being released, and Turner Classics would air some of these films, and they're amazing. So if you haven't seen silent films at the correct speed, I urge you to, because they're magnificent, and the actors are brilliant, and it's a totally different aesthetic, and really well worth. They're slower, and so you really have to kind of meet them halfway, but they're really worth watching, and they're just brilliant. And of course, Metropolis. You should all see the restored Metropolis. Don't watch the truncated versions. Seek out the recent restoration that adds 40 minutes that were discovered. But we're not in the 20s. We're in 1964. It happened here, and British film, wonderful. And then we also get another strange film that's an Italian-Spanish co-production, Planet of the Vampires. And it's a cool film, and the color scheme is this lurid reds and blues, and the astronauts wear these strange leather black uniforms that are, the one person pointed out, are reminiscent of our Space Command uniforms, but even weirder. And it stars Barry Sullivan, who was again an American movie star, and he's good in this film, though you get a feeling of him kind of wondering what he's doing in the film, and but it's still Mario Bava was an Italian director who would become one of the great horror directors, and he brings a horror sensibility to this film. It's sort of a mashup of a vampire film and a science fiction film, but really interesting and creepy, and its visual aesthetic is just really interesting. So again, I recommend that film. It's a good one. And now we also have talked previously about Burt I. Gordon, who was doing kind of schlocky films in the 50s. Well, he continues that in the 60s with Village of the Giants, which stars Tommy Kirk and Johnny Crawford and Beau Bridges as teenagers. And it's these teenagers who become giants, And Tommy Kirk was kind of a heartthrob kind of actor. He was in a lot of kind of Disney kind of films. And Johnny Crawford, of course, played the Rifleman's son, Chuck Connor's son, in the Rifleman TV show. And Beau Bridges, of course, was uh, is Jeff Bridges' brother and Lloyd Bridges' son, and he was in a lot of films with his brother. But here he's a teenager. So this is a curiosity, but it's a fun movie again, kind of a drive-in treasure, and not one of the great films, but an entertaining film, and particularly if you're a fan of Hollywood history, this is worth seeing. Then we get to Voyage of the Prehistoric Planet. Now, previously I talked about the Russian film, which was, the Planeta Burr, and that was, acquired by Roger Corman, and it was made first as Voyage of the Prehistoric Planet, and they shot extra footage. Curtis Harrington, who was kind of a noir director, shot Basil Rathbone and Faith Domergue or Domergue, how it was pronounced, who had been in This Island Earth and so forth. He shot extra scenes with them. Basil Rathbone by now was elderly. He'd of course been famous in the 30s and 40s, particularly playing Sherlock Holmes, and but now he was older, and but still wanted to work. And these actors, like Boris Karloff and Peter Lorre and so forth, they wanted to work, and they could find with Roger Corman, with some of these producers, they would work, or they'd go to other countries, and this gave them legitimate work in film, and but it's very interesting to compare Voyage of the Prehistoric Planet, and then there was, of course, Voyage of to the Planet of the Prehistoric Women. We'll get to that when we get to it. But basically, they would acquire these foreign films and use the production value of these films and intercut movie stars who they could use on the marquee, and so that's one of those. And so now we kind of, and then we have a movie like War Gods of the Deep, which was directed by Jacques Tourneur, the great noir director of Cat People and Curse of the Demon, and he was a great director on Twilight Zone as well. He did a great episode called Night Call, written by Richard Matheson. War Gods of the Deep is kind of a forgettable film, but it stars Vincent Price and Tab Hunter, who was another heartthrob. Some of these heartthrobs in later years would come out and reveal that they were gay. Tab Hunter did that, and but it's an okay film. I mean, again, diverting. But we've reached the midpoint where we're going to start talk. We've gone through 1965, and with those last few films. So basically, 65 is 10th Victim, Alphaville, Doctor Who and the Daleks. It Happened Here, Planet of the Vampires, Village of the Giants, and Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet, and War Gods of the Deep. And again, directors who had been on top in the 30s and 40s, by now they were elderly and taking lower class films, because again, they wanted to work too. So this was kind of like a way of actors as they were moving into their 60s and 70s to get work. And so we're going to stop right here for now, and we'll pick it up next time with 1966 through 69, which is a great period for science fiction film. And but you can see that the films have much more variety during this decade. They're not just the same handful of tropes, and you start to get new writers, new actors, new ideas, and some of these would then again become TV shows or inspire TV shows. So we'll pick it up next time. This has been Mark Zickery's Mr. Sci-Fi's History of Science Fiction. We started with books, so you can go back and look at my history of books, and you can go back and watch the history of film, and then after this we'll do the history of radio and television, maybe also fleetingly do the history of comics and other stuff. But it's been a great sharing this with you. And remember, check out our GoFundMe campaign. Please throw some money our way, because I'm eager. I mean, we're still building sets, we're still building costumes, we're still building creatures, but I want to roll camera and we're going to get the Nichelle Nichols scene to you very, very soon. We're going to get some more scenes from our pilot, our 2-hour pilot. Lots is ahead. But every dollar you should throw our way, or every $100 or $1,000, or buy shares for $7,500. As I mentioned, we very much want to shoot the framing story with Mira Furlan in Forgiveness. It's a great story, and she'll be great in it. And for $15,000, we can shoot the stuff with Mira. And so if you want to buy 2 shares of Space Command, that'll do it. And we'll shoot that this month. And we've already been laying our plans and designing it, and cannot wait to do it. And it's just, you can help and make it all all come true. So, and we're, we're still pitching Space Command as a show. We're going to be showing it in Duluth in about a week at the Catalyst Content Festival in Duluth. And so if you're in Minnesota or want to head toward Minnesota, we'll be there and we'll greet you with open arms. And you'll get to see even more of Space Command than you've seen before. So that's it for now. We'll talk to you again real soon. Sorry about the the iPhone falling over twice, but Dave Edison, my erstwhile editor, my friend and colleague, is down with the same flu that I've had, that Elaine's had, and I don't want to bother him to like clip that out, and I haven't bothered to learn how to do that, which I'm sure all of you will gasp and say, "My God, what an idiot!" But of course, I live in the future and in the 20th century, and the 21st century is, I'm here, but not as adept as I might be. So that's about it for now. Thanks a lot for sharing this, and we'll talk to you real soon. Bye, guys.